Jaya. Good again, Tadaga Nane Gang, Manozing, Mason, Mevan, Temple Chose. I did on the Tadavan Jewutin Debe, good again, Mano, Tada, Temple Show. Jewut Tamji Chamber, good again to the Kanshina, Meva, Tatabu, Mulun the Drive, Tada Temple Menu Mugi. Yang 좀 전에 영어버서 상견이 두전으로 시계 셔버듯이 다가 좀 전에 이제 간이기 샤도 스르다대야 주어지려 수가 아니
So a question arises if we are to seek the causes and conditions of Buddhahood. So here Kamala Shila says that I shall explain these on the basis of the Buddha's scriptures, and he says that someone like him is in not a position to independently or autonomously explain what are the causes and conditions for the attainment of Buddhahood. So here this question raises, so in general, when we talk about reality, there are three aspects. One is the evident phenomena, and concealed phenomena, and extremely concealed hidden phenomena. So from the point of view of science, so most of the subjects the science relates with are the evident phenomena. So most of science is based on what the senses can observe. So you can just point your finger and say, that is reality. So scientists, so up to now, the scope of science really remains within that domain of empirical, evident phenomena. Then, as you inquire deeply into the nature of this external reality, then of course science also lead to greater questioning. What are the underlying causes and conditions, the forces and so on? So these are questions now we see being raised in science as well. Then there is the second dimension of phenomena, which is the slightly concealed or hidden phenomena, which can only be understood on the basis of inference and reasoning. And the third dimension of reality is the extremely hidden phenomena. For example, if two people were to come into each other, meet with each other, so we can observe each other's body, they can listen to what the other person says. So all of that is part of the evident everyday phenomena, something that is open to the accessible to the senses. And then from the expressions of the person and the speech, the tone and so on, based on that we can infer what might be the attitude and thought and biases of that person. So this we use inference. We infer their states of mind on the basis of what we observe about the behavior and expression of this person. So now we are already at the second dimension of reality, which is this slightly concealed phenomena. But then there is the third level of phenomena, reality. So at this very moment when the person is talking, two people are talking. So what are the speed with which the thoughts are operating? Why do these thoughts kind of occur and so on? Will remain totally opaque to the other person. The person may be obvious to themselves, but those kind of subtle thought processes cannot be inferred by another person. So it is only on the basis of the testimony of this person other people can infer what might be the thought processes that is occurring in that person's mind. So then how do we infer that person's states of mind on the basis of their testimony? And a testimony alone is not adequate. We need other corroborating evidence that the person is reliable, there is no reason for that person to tell a lie, and because he's telling us from the perspective of his own personal experience, and he wouldn't tell a lie because there is no reason to do so. And on these basis, then we can say, okay, we can trust what the person says. So in Buddhism, so many of the inquiry and presentation are really about these three levels of reality. So a large part of that is really the everyday reality of our experience, something that is common to the scientist. So therefore, we have plenty to talk about with the scientist. And then there is a deeper level of reality, which is the impermanent nature of phenomena and their lack of objective independent existence and so on. So these things, when we subject the phenomena to critical inquiry, then we can derive such conclusions. So those conclusions are derived on the basis of our observance of the actual evident everyday reality. Then there is also the subtle level of reality where, for example, like the subtle workings of karmic world. Of course, broad terms, we can see how cause and effect work. For example, today we are gathering here together, and we experience a certain temperature in the in this area, and so these we can broadly explain their causes and conditions. But on this very day, out of hundreds of years, on this month, in this month, on this day, why is there such a particular type of weather? That is question. So if the question is how did that happen, science will probably be able to tell us the answer. So then we can trace it back to the weather patterns in this particular area, and the temperature movements and so on. But if the question is why, then science is not in a position to answer. So here, so the temperature changes are relevant to the experience of the people and the sentient beings living in that environment. So there is a connection. So then here, karma comes into the picture. There's a karmic activity in it. So when we talk about karma, we're talking about actions of body, speech, and mind. So there is that karmic connection, because when we talk about experience of pain and pleasure, we're talking about experience of sentient being, and the causes and conditions that lead to experience of pain and pleasure. It's not simply confined to external causation, but there's also a causation within the mental continuum of the sentient being. So when we talk about the mental continuum, and when we talk about mental phenomena, we're not talking about material phenomena. We're talking about something that is purely in the nature of experience. So when it comes to the causal relationship in that world of the mind, it's a very complicated question. So there are external 5 elements, and then there are internal 5 elements. And within the internal 5 elements, there are grosser levels, subtle levels, and extremely subtle levels. So ultimately, the explanations found in the highest yoga tantra, where there is a description of the subtle, extremely subtle energy or wind. This is really the basis from which it connects the internal elements with the external elements. And this is how the connection between the outer and the inner is made. So we often speak about it's due to karma, it's due to karma. Then the question is, what is the nature of karma? What are the types of karma? What is a mental karma? And so when we talk about mental karma, we're not talking about material phenomena, but then the karma, which is a mental phenomena, has an effect on material world. But then what the question is, it's a very complicated issue. So then each individual persons have their own karmic causation, and then also there is a collective karma as well. So many aspects of the subtle workings of the karma, they remain extremely hidden phenomena. So therefore, Kamala Shila says that the causes and conditions and the methods for attainment of the Buddhahood includes understanding the nature of reality of all these 3 levels: evident phenomena, slightly concealed, and extremely hidden phenomena. So then he says it is only by relying on the Buddha's scriptures that we will be able to find explanations of reality at all these levels. But in order to rely on the testimony of the Buddha scriptures, first we have to prove that the teacher, the Buddha, is reliable, a true, authentic teacher. So in Pramanavartika, Dhammakriti says that it's therefore first by developing confidence in the veracity of the Buddha's teaching on impermanence, no self, and so on, one will be able to then, develop a genuine confidence in the authenticity and reliability of the Buddha. So when we talk about these teachings on impermanence and so on, we know that there are methods in these that really enable us to deal with destructive mental forces and acquire deep levels of calmness and peace of mind. So a core part of that understanding of the reality are the Four Noble Truths that I explained before. So, and based on that, we need to cultivate the practice of the two bodhicittas. The conventional bodhicitta, which is based on compassion and aspiration for enlightenment, and then ultimate bodhicitta, which is the realization of the emptiness of one's own mind. So, as I explained this morning, it is by realizing the truth of no self, particularly of the absence of, self-sufficient, substantially real self, one will be able to undermine the intensity of many of the afflictions. And then by developing deeper understanding of the view of emptiness, then we will be able to undermine the afflictions that arises from the subtle level of grasping. So therefore, in the 400 stanzas on the middle way, composed by Aryadeva, a commentary to this, which was composed by Chandrakirti, Chandrakirti speaks of how afflictions such as attachment, lust, anger, and so on, there are two types. One is where they arise from ignorance. The other one is where they engage with their objects in conjunction with ignorance. So the afflictions that arise on the basis of ignorance, they are actually coarser levels of afflictions, but those that accompany ignorance are the subtle ones. So the afflictions that arise in dependence upon ignorance, grasping at true existence, so once you are able to realize the no self, then it will really affect these afflictions. And as you deepen your understanding of no self and arrive at the subtle understanding of emptiness, then it will undercut the basis for the arising of subtle levels of afflictions, particularly those that are concomitant with grasping at inherent existence. So in this way, you will get a sense that if this is the case, then cessation may be possible. So then you will come to have deeper conviction in the possibility of attainment of liberation. So it is from the point of view of presentation of emptiness, one can gain deeper understanding of what is enlightenment. Therefore, in 400 stanzas, Aryadeva says in the 400 stanzas that it is by reflecting upon the deeper truth of emptiness and dependent origination, and on the basis of that understanding and explanation, one will be able to develop a deep faith in the Buddha's teaching. And this is very relevant in our time today. So Aryadeva says that it is on the basis of understanding the Buddha's teaching on no self and emptiness, one will then be able to develop a genuine admiration and confidence in the teachings of the Buddha. So And how do we develop a confidence in the Buddha as a teacher? It's by subjecting his teaching and at the core teachings to inquiry and developing a deep confidence in the truth of these teachings, such as impermanence, no self, emptiness, and so on. So once we're able to develop such confidence, then we will be also able to rely on the Buddha's teaching on other matters, such as how to attain higher rebirth and so on. So here in the text, Kamalashila says that he will explain these causes and conditions based on relying on the Buddha's scriptures. Then he cites from the scripture. So here he explains that, and he's citing from a Vajrayana text, he says that omniscience arises from compassion, bodhicitta, and the right view of emptiness. So when we talk about compassion, there are different types of compassion. Compassion just focused on the sentient beings suffering. Compassion focused on the suffering of sentient beings, accompanied by awareness of their impermanence. And also, depending upon the level of courage of the person, you also have different types of compassion. One where you simply wish others to be free from suffering. This is something that is found in the Charvakas as well. But for the more courageous people, when you realize that there are ways in which sufferings can be brought to an end, and once you recognize the sufferings arise from their causes and conditions, because if sufferings are eternal, then there is nothing can be done. But if sufferings are impermanent and they arise from causes and conditions, then we can ask the question, what are the antidotes to these causes and conditions? Can these antidotes be cultivated? And if we cultivate familiarity with these antidotes, can we cultivate to the level of infinite, optimal level? So through these reflections, we will gain a deeper confidence in the possibility of attainment of Buddhahood. So if that is the case, then it becomes important for us that we need to aspire for it. And not just ourselves, but all sentient beings possess Buddha nature. All beings, and the Buddha's enlightened activity reaches all sentient beings. So as explained in the Uttara Tantra, when these explanations are given, then a sense of courage arises. So not just wishing others to be free from suffering, but actually wanting to do something about it and wanting to bring about that realization of end of suffering. So this kind of compassion is a very powerful, courageous type of compassion. So its compassion is one of the causes, primary causes, and it arises from bodhicitta. So arising from compassion focused on all sentient beings. So when the thought arises that I shall bring an end to the suffering of all sentient beings equal to the number of space, equal to the expanse of space, then the question arises, how do I go about making that into a reality? Here the Buddha, it is said in the scriptures, the Buddha cannot, wash away the pain or remove the sufferings of pain by his hand, nor can he wash away the afflictions that are the causes and conditions of sufferings, nor can the Buddha transplant the realizations that he himself has by giving it to others. And so beings cannot be freed in this way. Then the question is, how does the Buddha help free sentient beings? And the sutra says it's only by showing the truth of reality. What is the actual way in which things do actually exist, and to introduce them, to show them this particular truth, and the sentient beings come to the recognition of that truth, familiarize it, internalize it, and then embody it. And in this way, sentient beings are freed. Since there is such diversity of mental dispositions within sentient beings, so when the Buddha had to teach the truth of reality to all sentient beings, the key is to make sure that the teaching that he gives is relevant and appropriate to that person. So there was a Mahasiddha once. He was invited by Indian king and he asked for a Dharma teaching. Holiness is greeting a Tibetan old lady there, asking, "Where is your seat?" So the teaching has to be taught on the basis of knowing the mentality and the mental disposition of the sentient beings. And in order to understand fully the specificity of the needs of sentient beings, that kind of knowledge can only be possible if the Buddha has omniscience. So the Buddha taught. So the aspiration for the Buddhahood is really about wanting to be in a situation state where you are able to recognize the specificity of the mental disposition and mentality of each and every other sentient being, and that should be the primary motive for seeking enlightenment, because you don't seek full enlightenment for your own personal self-interest. So therefore, Buddhahood arises from the compassion as a root, and it arises from bodhicitta. So compassion is part of the method aspect of the path, whereas bodhicitta, when we talk about bodhicitta is aspiration for enlightenment, and the Tibetan word for enlightenment is changchup, and we need to understand what it means. What does it mean? So it is composed of two words. One is the total elimination of all afflictions, and then total realization of the knowledge. So enlightenment is something that has to be understood as a state where the altruism is perfected to its optimal level. In one of the commentaries on Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, it says that the Bodhisattvas view sentient beings from the perspective of their compassion, and from the perspective of wisdom, they view the enlightenment. So, and this is of course talking about the more intelligent type of Bodhisattvas. In Ornament of the Middle Way, it is very clear. Shantarakshita explains. So the practitioners of higher aptitude, who is the principal audience for the Mahayana texts. So the way of approach of the intelligent one is really through the use of wisdom. We need to cultivate the understanding of enlightenment, which must be rooted in and accompanied by compassion as a motive, an underlying motive, so which is a union of method and wisdom. So bodhicitta arises through the union of method and wisdom. And compassion and bodhicitta arises particularly from the practices of the six perfections, especially that of perfection of wisdom. And it is the perfection of wisdom that will perfect one's compassion and bodhicitta. Therefore, Nagarjuna, in his precious garland, he says that anyone who aspires for the attainment of Buddhahood I can't remember the exact passage. it says that it must cultivate bodhicitta, compassion, and the non-dual wisdom of emptiness. Now I remember the text, yeah. So those who wish to attain enlightenment for oneself and all others, one must cultivate compassion as well as bodhicitta arising from it. So he explains that those are the three main factors that need to be cultivated: compassion, bodhicitta, and the non-dual view of emptiness. And Nagarjuna was the greatest master that expounded the Buddha's teachings on perfection of wisdom, particularly of the teaching on emptiness. And Nagarjuna was himself prophesied by the Buddha. So if you look at Nagarjuna's writings, it's with the objective point of view, it is so Nagarjuna was a great scholar, learned in epistemology, middle way philosophy, Buddhist teachings and so on, and even medical science. If you look at Nagarjuna's writing, even a single word is impressive, because you have other great masters like Asanga. So he has written extensively, and some of the texts that he has written, probably for specific audience, some of them cannot withstand reason. But Nagarjuna's writings are quite impressive. Similarly, of that of Buddha Palita. Then there is Bhava Viveka. He was an amazing scholar, but some of his writings can be subject to criticism. So, but then you have Chandrakirti and Shantideva. Their writings are really impressive, highly learned, great masters, Nalanda masters. They were philosophers, and it's not simply a question of having a textual knowledge. So they are able to integrate their understanding, and it's not simply just reporting what they have read, but subject them to critical inquiry and then extract the essence and then present it. That's a true scholar. So great masters like Nagarjuna and so on are really such important teachers. So some of you might think that, don't say that I'm being biased towards Nagarjuna. If you think about it, his 6 texts are available in the Tengyur. Just study them, you will understand. There are writings by Asanga and his followers, and compare them, then you will see what I mean. So, and it's moved by compassion and motivated by compassion. The aspiration to seek Buddhahood arises. And the first level is the aspiring dimension of bodhicitta. And then, based on that, the wish to engage in the Bodhisattva practices arises. You then take the vow and then engage in the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva practices. And within the 6 perfections practices, so the last 2 are the important ones. So the perfection of concentration and perfection of wisdom, when they are undertaken in a unique way, then Vajrayana practices where their uniqueness emerges. And then Kamalashila explains that how do we go about this after having generated compassion and bodhicitta, he says that first you have to develop a recognition that grasping at self is the source of all the problem. In Shantideva's text, he says that all the problems in the world arises from excessive cherishing at self. All the happiness in the world arises from cherishing the welfare for others. And he says that if we don't exchange ourselves with others, and do not think about others' well-being, even when we remain within the cyclic existence, there will be no joy. So in the world we see this. For example, if we don't take compassion and altruism seriously, then we human beings are capable of really horrible acts where we are willing to kill others without any sense of apprehension. So therefore Shantideva says that let alone attainment of Buddhahood, if you are not altruistic, there's not even a possibility of a genuine happiness even within the cyclic existence as well. So for the practitioners, it is very important to be able to recognize the value of altruistic outlook. And when you are able to think more about others' welfare, even within family, you will have a happier family. Individually, you will be happier. I have a lot of opportunities to talk to a very vast range of audiences. And I always tell people, whether or not you become religious is an individual matter. But what is important is to be compassionate. So, for example, if you are excessively self-centered, then even if you were to practice religion, it's not going to lead anywhere. So instead, it's better to be non-religious, but be altruistic and compassionate. So these days, look at the religious world. The Shias and Sunnis are followers of the same Allah. They're followers of the same Quran. They pray commonly 5 days a week, 5 times a day. But because of this minor difference between the lineages, they look at each other as enemies. Similarly, once I was in Northern Ireland, the division, the animosity between the Catholics and the Protestants is just unbelievable. So, and they're using difference of religious faith as a basis to instill hatred of the other side. And this is truly tragic. From that point of view, it's better to be not religious at all. So then Kamalashila explains to overcome excessive self-centeredness, and then based on that, then engage in the cultivation of the merit and wisdom. So when we talk about accumulations, the Sanskrit word is samvara, and it refers to the causes and conditions that lead to Buddhahood. So those aspects of the accumulation that lead to the attainment of Buddha's form body, they are merits. Those aspects of the accumulation that lead to the attainment of Buddha's truth body, Dhammakaya, that is the wisdom aspect of the path. So therefore, Kamalashila explains that at the root of all of the Buddha's teaching and the causes and conditions for Buddhahood really is compassion. Therefore, first I will explain compassion. And then he cites the sutra where the Buddha says that what is that one thing? If I have it, if one has it, all other virtues come into one's hand. The Buddha says it's compassion. So then he says that he will explain how to cultivate compassion, and it is through training the mind. So it's not enough to simply say you need to cultivate compassion. You have to gradually, step by step, cultivate compassion. So the first step is to cultivate equanimity, to cultivate an even-handed attitude, even-minded attitude to all sentient beings. So first you need to cultivate an even-mindedness. So when we talk about equanimity, So we need to overcome our biases because of our feeling of nearness and distance. So a lot of us, for our close friends or family, we wish them well and we make prayers and so on. And but towards those people that we don't like, enemies and so on, we in fact might even wish them ill instead of happiness. So such biased attitude, while you remain in that caught in that, there is no possibility of having the thought wishing happiness for all beings. So the first step really is to cultivate that even mindedness. So here a fundamental attitude is the recognition that all beings are equal in wishing for happiness and wishing to avoid suffering. And then you ask yourself, why is it then we make such discriminations? And why are we angry towards some, attached to few? So there are two ways in which equanimity can be cultivated. One is on the basis of recognizing the fundamental equality of our aspiration that all of us wish happiness and do not want suffering. And here techniques are presented in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland and Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. This is the approach that is emphasized, which I think is a more effective, and especially for those intelligent practitioners. But for those who are more approaching from the faith side, then the 7-point cause and effect method presented in Asanga's writings and Atisha's writings could be helpful. But the tradition is to combine the two and then engage in the practices, and this is the tradition in the Tibetan Buddhism. So the first is to cultivate this perspective of equanimity, that all beings are equal in wishing happiness and do not want suffering. And this is emphasized particularly in Shantideva's text. So Shantideva's text was written in the 8th century. Shantideva, composed by him. From then up until today, when it comes to cultivation of bodhicitta, particularly exchanging with self and others, there hasn't been any greater text other than the Shantideva's text. This is a very impressive text, most important. Those of us who are interested, we should really study this Shantideva's text. This is very important. So it is good for if you include Shantideva's text as part of your daily meditation. Although it is good to do the rituals on a daily basis, but more effective will be to keep Shantideva's text and read it once in a while. Of course, you can't read all 10 chapters every day, but once in a while, read the sections of it, few pages of it. If you read on a daily basis and reflect on the meaning, this would be really helpful, beneficial. In my case, in 1967, I received transmission from Kunalama Tenzin Gyatso, and since then I have taught Shantideva's text extensively to many people. On a daily basis, also I reflect on Shantideva's text. I find it hugely beneficial, and I find that so the transformation of my mind from the approach of bodhicitta and compassion really is thanks to the Shantideva's text, and transformation of my mind from the wisdom practice is thanks primarily to Nagarjuna's writings. And then Shantideva, for example, asks, if others and myself are equal in wishing happiness and do not want suffering, why am I special and not others? He asked that question. And then he explains that all sentient beings, equal to the expanse of sentient beings, space, are equal in having this fundamental aspiration. Then why we obsess just with our own aspiration and well-being? And similarly, if all are equal in aspiring for happiness and of wishing to avoid suffering, why are we thinking only about our own pursuit? And then similarly, he says that furthermore, the more we allow ourselves to be governed by excessive self-centeredness, it tends to lead to problem. Whereas if we are more altruistic, compassionate, we ourselves become happy. We create a happy family, happier community, and also people enjoy being with you. So, on the other hand, if we are excessively self-focused, then we also create more enemy. We tend to take things much more heavily and seriously, and because of this disturbed state of mind, our although health comes to be undermined as well. We bring more stress. So even within this lifetime, we create more enemy if we are more excessively self-focused. Whereas if we are less focused on ourselves, if we are more focused on others, even if we might have an enemy today, that enemy could potentially turn into a friend that tomorrow or future. So this teaching on exchanging of self and others is a very powerful practice, and on that you should really look at Shantideva's text. And Shantideva's text is based on Nagarjuna's precious garland, where particularly there is a text by Nagarjuna called Commentary on Awakening Mind. And then Kamalashila explains the 7-point cause and effect method. So then he explains that we should deal with excessive biased attitude. So when it comes to love and affection, even the animals have basic level of it, but they are not able to extend it beyond their immediate circle. So here when we talk about compassion, we are talking about a compassion that is unbiased, that extends to all beings without any discrimination. So that kind of non-discriminatory compassion must be able to reach even your enemy as well. And this is the objective here. And then he explains how to develop this equanimity. First, bring to your mind a neutral person that you neither feel attached to nor feel averse towards. And then also cultivate an image of your enemy, and then cultivate compassion towards the neutral person as well as enemies. So if you're able to cultivate compassion and extend compassion towards enemy, then of course you have cultivated an unbiased compassion, because the compassion that is biased is found also among animals. And then after that you cultivate loving kindness, and then so then the loving kindness becomes a moist. His Holiness is explaining that there's a typo in the text that was printed. Instead of saying moist, it has written gold, sir. So here the text is talking about loving kindness as a moisture. So with equanimity as a base, so using equanimity as a ground, and loving kindness as a moisture, and then if you plant the seed of compassion, it will thrive. So in this way you cultivate compassion, and this compassion has the nature of wishing to see the end of suffering of all beings. So in order to cultivate compassion for all beings, and particularly the courageous form of compassion that wants to bring about the end of suffering of all sentient beings, so first it is important to cultivate a sense of identification, or sense of empathetic connection with sentient beings. So this is the loving kindness. And in order to cultivate that, there are different techniques. One is on the basis of cultivating exchanging of self and others, based on the recognition of the fundamental equality of all beings, wishing to be happy and wishing to avoid suffering. The other approach is to use the 7-point cause and effect method to then cultivate this empathetic identification and sense of connection with other sentient beings. And here, it's a cultivating a view to see other sentient beings as dear to you, because the closer you feel towards someone, the more empathetic you will be towards that person's situation. Holiness is pointing out to some people that he knows. He says, smile so that I can see whether you have your teeth intact or not. And some children, they lose their tooth, and then when the adult teeth has not grown, you have an unusual mouth. So in the 7-point cause and effect method, you start with equanimity, you cultivate recognition of all beings as your mother, you reflect on their kindness, you cultivate the wish to repay their kindness, and then which leads to compassion and so on. So another important factor is to cultivate a deeper understanding of what is meant by suffering. The Buddha, in his first public sermon, he talked about the nature of suffering. He said, this is the truth of suffering. This is the truth of origins of suffering. And then he says that you must recognize suffering, you must eliminate the origin of suffering, you must actualize the cessation, and you must cultivate the path. So in this way, the functions of the Four Noble Truths have been explained. So the first teaching really was the cultivation of the truth of suffering. So the first is to recognize the Four Noble Truths. And here we are talking about the nature of reality. So then the question is, how come cessation is part of the reality? But if you inquire what is the true nature of cessation, it's really emptiness. And when we talk about emptiness, we're actually talking about the nature of reality. We're not talking about something that has been newly cultivated. Because all phenomena, right from the beginning, they are devoid of independent inherent existence. So in Sutra, Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the Buddha says that whether Tathagatas appear in the world or not, the truth of reality will always remain the same. So emptiness is about the nature of reality. So our nature of our mind is empty. So the teachings on the Four Noble Truths is actually about the truth of the Four Noble Truths. Then the next, he explains what are the functions of the knowledge of the two truths. Then he says that we must recognize the suffering, abandon the causes, origin, actualize the cessation, and then cultivate the path. And then, if by cultivating such path, what do we actualize? Then he explains that although suffering is to be recognized, but when you eliminate the origins of the suffering, there is no more further suffering to be eliminated. So similarly, although origin of suffering needs to be eliminated, once they are eliminated, there is no more origin or cause of suffering to be eliminated. And then truth of the cessation must be actualized. But once you have actualized it, then there is no more cessation to be actualized. And then the ultimate cessation is the attainment of the Buddhahood, which is a state that is totally free from the two defilements. And similarly, once you have cultivated the path on the basis of cultivating the understanding, critically reflecting upon it, and then actualizing it and experiencing it, then once you have gained the direct realization of the truth and culminated in the cultivation of the path, then there is no more path to be cultivated. For example, with respect to emptiness, first you develop intellectual understanding, then you critically reflect upon it, develop a deeper conviction, which then becomes familiar, and then it becomes experiential. Then you attain a path of seeing, And then when the path of seeing is further refined, then you attain the path of meditation, which then culminates in the attainment of path of no more learning. So, for example, Nagarjuna says in the 5 stages, what has already been cultivated need no longer be cultivated again. So he talks about how when the state of union is attained, then there is no more stages to be cultivated. So the Buddha says that once the path has been actualized, there is no more path to be actualized. So the Four Noble Truths explains, the teaching explains both the ground, the path, and the result as well. So when the path is presented, the suffering, recognition of suffering, understanding of suffering is the first step. Here, Panchen Lama Losong Chökyen says that when the truth of suffering is being understood, we are not talking about just everyday evident pain, because the wish to be relieved from such situation is something that even the animals have it. So when we talk about suffering, we tend to immediately think of the evident everyday pain. But when the Buddha is talking about the truth of suffering, he's really talking about a deeper level of meaning of suffering. And he's talking about the conditioned existence caused by karma and afflictions. So, but as Panchen Lama says that the wish to be free from everyday pain is something that even the animals have. What needs to be cultivated is the wish to be free from suffering at this deeper level. I mean, many of the Tibetans who have come here to the States, some of you have come legally, some of you may have come illegally. But why did you come here? Because you want to have happiness, understood in these mundane terms of economic success and so on. But from the point of view of a true Dharma practitioner, what you are aspiring for is ultimately in the nature of suffering. Because what we conventionally identify as happiness is really a suffering of change. And this is something even the non-Buddhist Indian traditions, Hindu traditions, also recognize as ultimately being a form of suffering. Because the object of meditation practice in the Hindu is to attain, to move beyond the state of pleasure. So then the question is, what is it that is unique to the Buddha's understanding of suffering? Then Panchen Lama says that it refers to the very fact of our conditioned existence caused by karma and affliction. So if one's understanding of suffering is brought to that deeper level of the very fact of our conditioned existence, which is been projected by our past karma, which is governed by karma and afflictions, which serves as the basis for the further arising of afflictions. So this conditioned existence itself is in the nature of suffering. This is what contributes to further afflictions and suffering. So this very conditioned existence is the vessel which supports our experience of suffering. It's the vessel that contains the potential for future suffering. So, for example, when we at the point of death, so when we talk about the grasping that arises at the end of death, there is a grasping at continued existence. So this clinging and grasping continues to remain part of our everyday experience. So it is by recognizing our very conditioned existence as in the nature of suffering. This is the third level of the meaning of suffering. And it is the understanding of that nature of suffering that is needed to be cultivated here. So when the Buddha explained the nature of that suffering, the first step he explains is the impermanence. He says our existence is impermanent. So when we think about the nature of sufferings, it's not adequate simply to say Buddha says so in the scriptures. Then we have to ask, why is our very existence in the nature of conditioned by suffering? So we have to recognize, understand that our condition is our existence is conditioned by affliction, and it is governed by grasping and clinging, and it is a result of past karma. And it's the past karma that has been activated by clinging and grasping, craving and grasping, that has brought about this present birth and existence. So if the primary cause of our conditioned existence is that, then it shows that our existence is governed by other factors. And in general, all phenomena, causally conditioned phenomena, are governed by their causes. And anything that is causally produced are subject to arising and cessation. Normally, when we think about arising and cessation, we think about arising as coming from somewhere and ceasing as going somewhere. But if we think deeply, actually arising and ceasing are simultaneous. The moment we are born, our process for cessation has already begun. For example, here, we're together here. This morning we all came together, and then later, after the afternoon session, people will go to their own places. So that gathering, which happened in the morning, in the evening, they come to an end, this gathering. So this phenomenon of the gathering and the cessation of that, it is, unless it goes through change on a moment-by-moment basis, we wouldn't be able to explain for this change that came together and that's separated. Let us take the example of our body. So myself, I'm 80 years old now. I'm an old person, and this old person's body, so every year has 12 months. Every month has about around 30 days. Each day has 24 hours. And if you think through in terms of such time, the changes that are occurring on the 24-hour basis must take place on an hour-by-hour basis. Hourly changes must come from minute changes. Minute changes must come from second-by-second changes. So we can get to the level of even atomic basis. And these days, scientists say that through microscope, I had a chance to look at atom, and you can see that it is so unstable. There's an activity even at the atomic level. So when you reach to the very subtle atomic level, nothing remains static, even for a single second. They are moving constantly all the time. This is what is meant by subtle impermanence. And that changing activity was occurring right from the very moment of its birth, very moment of its arising. But this is something that we need to critically reflect and understand. It is not obvious to us. So when we think about it, the arising and ceasing are actually simultaneous. We cannot say it arose here and then it ceased here. If you look through this temporal process, therefore the Buddha says that everything that is conditioned existence is momentary. It changes on a moment-by-moment basis because everything is changing on a moment-by-moment basis. So this moment-by-moment basis change, so it is a function of the cause. The very cause that produced the thing actually produced that process of cessation as well. On a macroscopic, gross level of experience, we can talk about a beginning of a thing and an ending of a thing. But this is at a very gross, conventional level. So, for example, a person's life. There is a birth, there is a death. But that's a very gross level of change. But if you look at the subtle level, then the change is very momentary. Then that changing nature, is brought by the cause itself. There is no other third factor that comes into the picture and starts causing the change. Very cause that brought that phenomena into being already brought into being that phenomena with a built-in mechanism for its cessation. So our body, our existence, is conditioned by karma and afflictions. So the primary cause of our existence is affliction. And what causes us experience of pain and suffering is really affliction. So for example, things that cause us disturbance, unhappy states of mind, it's all afflictions that underlies them. So long as we remain under the power and domination of afflictions, we are in the nature of suffering. So when we think about suffering nature based on impermanence, where they are changing on a moment by moment basis, and they are conditioned by cause, and that cause ultimately is ignorance, then we will know that our very existence itself is within the bounds of suffering. And once you have recognized that nature of suffering, then you can cultivate the view of no self, the wisdom of no self. One is to point to us that this impermanent, conditioned existence is not worthy of grasping as self. So that's one way of understanding how impermanence leads to suffering, and understanding suffering, and how understanding of suffering leads to grasping at understanding leads to the understanding of no self. Alternatively, by understanding suffering, particularly recognizing how suffering arises from ignorance and afflictions, and so the causes afflictions, and afflictions are rooted in ignorance, which is a distorted state of mind and perspective, and that distorted ignorance is not part of the essential nature of mind. They arise adventitiously, conditioned by past grasping and clinging, and triggered by immediate conditions. So once we recognize that, then we will come to develop the understanding that the essential nature of mind itself is pure, which then leads us to the understanding of emptiness of mind. So the emptiness and no self, the view of emptiness and no self arises. So according to Madhyamaka, when we talk about emptiness, in this context, we're talking about the understanding of self as being devoid of inherent existence, and also the basis of the arising of self, our aggregates, as being devoid of inherent existence. So this is, for example, in the Heart Sutra, the Buddha says that even the aggregates, 5 aggregates too, are devoid of inherent existence. So in the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, not only the no self or person is explained, but also the selflessness or no self of phenomena is also explained. And this is a very profound teaching. Therefore, Heart Sutra says that even the 5 aggregates as well must be viewed as devoid of inherent existence. So in Chinese translation, this word as well doesn't seem to be present, but in Tibetan we have it. So I asked a scholar whether the original Sanskrit contains that word as well, and they say it does, which I think is quite significant, because what the Buddha is saying is that not only is this person devoid of inherent existence, but also the aggregates, which is the basis for the thought of person or sense of self, are also devoid of inherent existence as well. So, in the first training of the Wheel of Dharma, the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, Buddha emphasized the teaching on the no self or person. But in the second turning of the Wheel of Dharma, the perfection of wisdom, he emphasizes not only the person to be devoid of selfhood, but also the aggregates, the phenomena, to be devoid of selfhood and inherent existence as well. So this includes all our aggregates as well as the external phenomena and so on. So this is why in the Heart Sutra we read no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no volitions and so on, no eye, no nose and so on. So not only the grasping at the person is to be rejected, but also grasping at the basis of the arising of self, the aggregates themselves must be negated as well. So for the Buddhist practitioners, developing this deeper level of understanding of suffering is quite important, because conventionally we tend to be attached to a lot of our sensory experience, and we see many of these external conditions to be sources of our happiness, good food and many of the sensory objects. And but the Buddha's teaching explained to us ultimately they are also sources of suffering, and even the happiness that we feel attracted to are ultimately in the nature of suffering, because our very conditioned existence comes from afflictions and ignorance. So in this way we recognize the deeper meaning of suffering. So this is what the Buddha means when he says that cultivate the knowledge of the suffering. And then in this way we develop deep compassion for all sentient beings who are caught within this conditioned existence, because otherwise our compassion will be contingent only on very evident suffering of other sentient beings, and instead of feeling compassion we will feel envious towards those who are successful in mundane terms. Um, so then we will get caught up in seeking happiness through external means, material means. So of course, that doesn't mean that you Tibetans who have come here should now give up and go back to India. But in India, even though you might go back, but then you might be struggling to just get the basic needs. So the point here is to have a deeper understanding of the meaning of suffering. So here, therefore, Kamalashila says that develop the understanding that all sentient beings in the entire three worlds are caught within the bounds of suffering, of three types of suffering: the evident, changing, suffering of change, as well as the conditioned existence. And then he explains the first level of suffering, which is the evident suffering, by specifically identifying the sufferings that are characteristic of the specific realms of existence, such as the animal realm, human realm, hell realms, and so on. Then he explains suffering that is specific to human beings, which is craving for wealth, fame, and so on, which leads to all sorts of problems, and which also is the basis for creating enmity, discriminations, and so on. So here, of course, Kamalashila is talking about the first level of suffering, evident suffering for human beings, where the suffering of birth, aging, illness, death, adversities, and so on. And then he says that we should cultivate compassion focused on the understanding of that level of suffering. And then the second type of compassion is to focus on the causes of suffering. So for example, here we are gathered. If we are not aware of what are the causes of suffering, then our compassion will be contingent just on the visible, evident suffering or pain. But many of us who are gathered here may not have evident suffering, but we possess all the potential suffering, which is the causes, the afflictions, strong attachment, anger, and so on. And furthermore, the very fact that we possess conditioned existence, um, there is simply no way we can avoid suffering completely. So by reflecting upon the causes of suffering, we then develop a different level of compassion by focusing on how all sentient beings are caught in the causes and conditions of suffering. By viewing sentient beings who may not be evidently suffering, but because they possess the causes, it's almost as if they are standing on the edge of a cliff and then are ready to fall off. So for example, in Dharmakriti explains that if the causes have been gathered, the effects will ensue. And then it explains that even the devas in the celestial realms may be free from evident pain and suffering, but they are also caught in the attachment, so they have potential suffering. And then the third level of suffering, he explains, is the very nature of our being conditioned by karma and afflictions, which pervades the existence of all beings. And he explains that so long as grasping at inherent existence, which is the fundamental ignorance, is not removed, the potential for suffering exists in all of us. And this is universal. Therefore, all beings, you should view them as if they are caught in the huge fire of suffering, and develop a genuine compassion with a sense of urgency, wanted to relieve all these beings from suffering and cultivate compassion. And then he explains the measure of how compassion arises. So you need to cultivate day and night, and then the measure of having generated that kind of universal compassion is that through cultivation. Then he explains how to do it. First, develop equanimity and even-mindedness, and then recognize all beings as having been related to you, such as being your mother. And then he explains what is the measure of having developed universal compassion. He says, if you get to a point where your attitude towards all beings will be that of a mother towards her newborn infant, where the sense of concern and caring is effortless and spontaneous, that's when you have attained great compassion, because that compassion will be present regardless of whether you are making effort or not. The moment you perceive a sentient being, that compassion will arise naturally, spontaneously in you, wishing to do something about that situation. And at that point, you have realized great compassion, the universal compassion. And then, when that compassion manifests in the form of wishing others happiness, the loving kindness arises. And then, having cultivated compassion, you should then cultivate bodhicitta. And then he explains there are two types of bodhicitta. One is the conventional bodhicitta, and one is the ultimate bodhicitta. And also the aspiring level of bodhicitta and the engaging level of bodhicitta. So there are many different ways in which bodhicitta can be explained and enumerated. And then in Abhisamaya Alamkara, there's a list of 22 levels of bodhicitta. So there are many different ways in which bodhicitta can be enumerated. So here, Kamalashila explains it in terms of the conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. And the conventional bodhicitta refers to the genuine aspiration to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. Ultimate bodhicitta refers to the direct realization of emptiness of one's own mind, based upon attainment of shamatha, calm abiding, and special insight, vipassana. So the first level of experience, which is the aspiring bodhicitta, so once you have gained some, then you should actually participate formally in a ceremony to confirm that aspiring mind. You can do it in the presence of a representation of the Buddha or in the presence of a teacher who can serve as a witness, which can help you develop deeper courage. So then it explains what type of teacher, and it explains the qualifications and cites from Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi, Bodhisattva levels, says that someone who should be versed in the Bodhisattva vows and someone who is compassionate towards the student. So this being versed is versed in the rituals and ceremony of conducting the bodhicitta vows. So this is important. So this is how bodhicitta is cultivated. So once you have cultivated the bodhicitta, conventional bodhicitta, one should cultivate the ultimate bodhicitta. And the ultimate bodhicitta refers to the direct realization of emptiness that is completely non-dual, free of conceptual elaborations. And it is a combination, it's a union of shamatha and vipassana. Without shamatha, tranquility, even though you may have gained realization of emptiness, it's not stable. It's like a lamp which may be bright, but it's being blown by wind. So the same, this is true for not just emptiness, but also bodhicitta, compassion, and so on. In all of these meditation practices, single-pointedness and ability to maintain your focused attention is very important. So this single-pointedness of mind generally is a common practice for both Buddhist and non-Buddhist Indian traditions. Later, I'm inquiring because I would like to meet with Indian mystics who have gained single-pointedness of mind, shamatha. In Tibetans they seem to be very rare. I have among American friends, I have few who are deep meditators who have gained quite high level of shamatha, single-pointedness mind. And among Tibetans, maybe they are hidden, they are remaining hidden, like a lamp hidden inside a container. But I think it's important, the Tibetans may have the knowledge and understanding, but we also need people who are practicing and really embodying and displaying that realization. So, as Aryasura says in the Jataka tales, that the learning should be followed by a single-pointed commitment to practice. And Vasubandhu says that the upholding of the Buddha's teaching should be done on the basis of teaching the scriptures, upholding the scriptures, as well as the realization. And he says there are only two aspects to the Buddha's teaching. One is the scriptural knowledge, and one is the realization. The scriptural knowledge is through study, and realization is through cultivation and meditation. So he says these are the only two ways. So that he doesn't include building temples or building big statues. So I always tell people that, like in Bodh Gaya, there's a big statue of the Buddha. So of course, I go for refuge. I have deep reverence. So whoever made it, I feel grateful. But I don't think this statue of the Buddha is going to speak. Or so this huge statue of the Buddha will be always smiling, silent, whether it is a scorching hot, or whether it is raining, or whether a bird lands on its head. So therefore, among all the activities of the Buddha, the most important thing is the Buddha's speech. For example, if you have an impressive professor in a university. If the Buddha, that professor cannot speak, what's the point of that professor? So it's the speech which is most important. And particularly for the Buddhists, the Buddhist religion is not something that can be done purely on the basis of faith. It's on the basis of understanding and inquiry, understanding the significance, meaning, the purpose, and so on. Cultivating the knowledge, critically reflecting upon it, then integrating it within one's own day to day life, and embodying the knowledge. So, therefore, the Buddha's activity is speech. The Buddha needs to speak. So, once I was in Tsopema, there is a lotus lake. There was a big statue of Padmasambhava. I was asked to come and consecrate. Of course, I admire what they've done. And that afternoon, I had to give a teaching. I told them, the congregation there's a wonderful statue built here of Padmasambhava. And on my part, I do Guru Yoga based on Guru Padmasambhava. He was tremendously kind to Tibet. But this statue of the Buddha, even if he were to stay for 1,000 years, he's never going to speak. So it's more important to take seriously the texts. So we have canonical collections of Kangyur and Tengyur. If people pay more attention, so when we hear the word Kangyur and Tengyur, we should not have the opinion just to put them in the altar and touch them with our head. That's not enough. We have to open them up, unwrap them, and study and read them. And there are commentaries and commentaries, and so on. So these are to be studied. So the study is really what is important. In Tibet, in the past, people, when we talk about studying Dharma, people think this is something that only the monks should be doing, and particularly the more philosophically oriented monastic members. But people feel that the Vajrayana tantric monasteries need to only do the rituals. There was no custom of studying. And then the lay people never studied. This, I think, is backward. And we should not uphold this saying this is our tradition. It's silly. Wherever there is backwardness, we need to change that. And this is how we make progress. We cannot say this is how we have always done it. This is our custom. So when we came to India in the 1959, we got there in the 60s, towards the end, early 70s. So many of the ritual monasteries, as well as the tantric colleges, so many monasteries that were in the past were ritual monasteries, where no classical studies were present. I made the appeal to them to really take seriously the actual study of the classics. Then I also urged the nunneries to particularly take studies seriously. So first in Dharamsala at Gandencholing nunnery, they began. I invited them, and then I also visited them, and I gave a transmission of a classic there, gave some explanation, and then I urged them to take studies seriously. Now we have today Gishima, a woman Gishi. So Gishima, a woman Gishi, they studied for 17 to 20 years. They have reached the standard. So now Gishimas, the women Gishis, are emerging. So similarly, lay people, I've been also urging them to study the text, classics, not by just following the faith, but using reasoning, dialectics, debate. As I explained before, in the second chapter of Pramanavartika, Dharmakirti, he explains the Four Noble Truths, on the basis of reasoning and in critical inquiry, which I find very effective. There are, of course, many scriptures that talk about the Four Noble Truths. When you read them, because there are no reasoning or arguments are presented, they are not that effective. But Dharmakirti's text in the second chapter, because the approach is critical inquiry, it's very powerful. So when it comes to critical inquiry and reasoning, Dignaga and Dharmakirti's texts are very important. And Dignaga was a student of Vasubandhu, and Dignaga is in fact known as more learned and more versed in logic and epistemology than his own teacher, Vasubandhu. So when it comes to epistemological texts, studying them really opens our mind and critical inquiry. the classical text on epistemology are really important. So as explained before, in China, so some texts were translated. For example, like Hidu Mukha was translated. There's a prose version of this. I don't know myself that exactly, but otherwise, many of the important texts by Dignaga, such as Pramana Samuchaya, there are other texts, and then Dharmakirti's text, like Pramana Vartika, Pramana Vinishya, and Pramana Pramana Nyaya Bindu. These are not available. They're available only in Tibetan. And now some of the Chinese Buddhists have reinstituted the study of the Buddhist epistemological texts. So as explained before, the Four Noble Truths are common to all Buddhist traditions, but those who rely on Pali texts tend to rely primarily on scriptures. But those who are familiar with the Dharmakirti's text, their approach to the understanding of Four Noble Truths is really based on reasoning and critical inquiry. So I think this is very important. So the lay people also, it's important to study Dharma. So when you study Dharma, and when you do that, it doesn't need to be, you don't even need to be Buddhist. Among scientists, there are who are not interested in Buddha Dharma as a religion, but they are taking great interest in the presentation on mind and emotions among scientists. And among the quantum physicists, they are also taking interest in Nagarjuna's writings. So, for example, when it comes to presentation of philosophy, the Buddhist texts are really extensive. And particularly in the Buddhist texts, the presentation of the science of mind is very extensive and sophisticated. So even though you might not be interested in Dharma as a spiritual path, but as a source of knowledge, the knowledge of mind and emotion and the science of mind is really impressive in the Buddhist texts. So by studying them, it makes you more enriched in your understanding of human nature and human condition, and also it will sharpen your own intelligence, and you will be equipped with a greater critical faculty, which I think is very helpful even in your day-to-day life. You know, so if you are more critically oriented, then you will not be gullible, which I think is very important in your life, because you need to be always questioning, always questioning. I speak of the 17 great masters of Nalanda. If you look at their texts, they always ask questions. There are hundreds and hundreds of questions, and these questions lead to inquiry. And on that basis, they have written them. They haven't simply said, Buddha said so, and that must be true, and I'm going to go that way. That's not their approach. So even the lay Tibetans, lay people, regardless of whether you are religious or not, I think it's important to really study these texts. And then recently we have compiled a book, compendium of science and philosophies from the Indian Buddhist sources. So the first 2 volumes on science have appeared. Some people say it's very helpful. Some people say it's tough. And then I told them that because it is tough, you have to study them. If you already know, there's no need to study. So recently I was in South India at Nagpur. A Buddhist center invited me. I spoke with an Indian, someone I've known for a long time. He told me, so once I gave an introduction to Buddhism in Nagpur, he said it was too tough. And he said, this time, please tell it very simple terms. So then I told him that if you want something very simple, then you already must know. Then I don't need to say anything. So I need to teach something that you don't know. So when we say study, we're talking about something that we don't know, and we want to enrich our knowledge and understanding. So when we refer to instructions, we're not talking about repeating what people already know. So this is, development of a new knowledge, new understanding, rising to the challenge and being kind of industrious and diligent. That's important. So even the old people walking on with the help of stick should see yourself as students. In Ladakh, old, men and women, grandparents, they are taking interest in the study. They have reading groups, they have discussion groups, and once they demonstrate it in front of me, and some of the older people, they speak very hard Ladakhi dialect. They were engaging in conversations of Four Noble Truths and so on. I was very impressed. So this is what the Tibetans should do too, and to learn the art of debating. So the ultimate bodhicitta refers to a non-dual mind, a direct realization of emptiness, the wisdom of supramundane level. This mundane and supramundane level is defined on the basis of whether or not someone has gained the Arya level of path. So, those who have yet to realize the direct antidote to grasping an inherent existence, those are ordinary beings. Those who have gained direct realization of emptiness, which serves as the direct antidote to ignorance, those are referred to as Arya beings or noble beings. So that is transcended the mundane level. So these are referred to as the Aryas or the noble beings. So such wisdom is free from conceptual elaboration because their realization is totally equipoised on emptiness. As Nagarjuna explains in the homage verse of the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, he says the emptiness, the realization, true realization of emptiness, is totally free from any conceptual elaboration, and it's clear. And one's realization is unwavering, like the lamp, without any wind, not disturbed by wind, where one has gained and perfected the union of shamatha and vipassana, tranquility and insight. So the text explains how all the realizations are really consequences of cultivating the two aspects of the meditation. One is single pointedness and one is insight. So conventionally as well, when we study from kindergarten up to university, we actually use both single pointedness as well as critical inquiry and insight. So we have to first study. So that is a kind of an inquiry, analysis, and once we have gained understanding, then we conclude, we develop confidence, then we keep our mind single-pointedly placed on that conclusion. That's a kind of shamatha, that's a kind of single-pointedness. So while, for example, if we are reading, so for example, if we are distracted, so like we are listening to music as well, with a half attention, we're not going to be able to recognize and absorb what we are reading. Whereas if we are reading without any distraction, what we read goes deeper into our mind. Similarly, the wisdom, there are many different aspects. You have sharp intelligence, penetrating intelligence, vast intelligence, comprehensive intelligence, and so on. So Kamalashila explains that all realizations are consequences of the application of single-pointedness, attention, and insight. So, with the single pointed attention, unwavering, focused on the chosen object, so when you cultivate that mind, because of that absorption of that single pointedness, your tendency to get distracted becomes lessened, and also the attachment arising from that kind of sensory distractions will also uh, become lessened. However, so Kamala Shila explains that the single pointed attention and concentration alone is not adequate, because this is what Buddha first did, when he was engaging in the 6 years of ascetic meditation practice. So, concentration alone doesn't lead to final liberation. Even though they might be very profound, one may attain profound levels of concentration, but it will never directly undermine the grasping at self. And as long as grasping at self remains, the basis for the arising of afflictions remains within us. Then the question is, what is the direct antidote to afflictions? Then Kamala Shila explains that it is by cultivating the view of no self. If one cultivates a single pointed concentration with the union of tranquility and insight, cultivate the view of no self, this will then act as a direct antidote to grasping at self, which will then open the way to the attainment of liberation. Then the question is asked, are there any other paths that can lead to liberation? And the answer is no. It is only through the path of no self. It is only through the cultivation of no self that one will attain liberation. Because without cultivating the view of no self, there is no final and direct antidote to the elimination of affliction. So then he concludes by saying that those who therefore aspire to cultivate the wisdom that leads to Buddhahood must cultivate shamatha as well as insight, vipassana. And then Kamala Shila goes on to give a lot of citations from the various sutras, emphasizing the need for the union of shamatha and vipassana. So he says that analytic approach and meditation alone, divorced of shamatha, again is also not effective, because special insight generally is premised upon the attainment of shamatha. Because vipassana, special insight, doesn't refer to just analytic approach alone, because this is a special kind of insight which arises on the basis of shamatha. But he says analytic approach without the foundation of shamatha, then that wisdom is not effective, because it's not firm and not stable. So therefore, the union of both shamatha, the single-pointed attention, as well as insight, vipassana, is indispensable. So having the shamatha is compared to there being no wind that would otherwise disturb the flame of wisdom, and wisdom or insight is compared to brightness, bright lamp, which can illuminate the truth. So when the two are combined, then you have a clear vision without any wavering. So the first, then he goes to explain the methods for cultivating shamatha. So it needs various conditions, such as choosing a place that is appropriate, conducive, which is not too noisy when you first cultivate shamatha. Once you have gained a certain level of attainment, then even though you might be living in a distracted, noisy area, it's fine. So once you're able to maintain single pointedness, then the sensory distractions come to be undermined. I have some friends told me that when this teacher, when the Lama is meditating and doing his practice, he doesn't, although his eyes are not closed, he's not sleeping, but because of the focus is so absorbed in this chosen object, as you become habituated, then the activity of the sensory modalities become inactive, and then this Lama, when he is absorbed in his practice, he doesn't even notice people moving around in front of him. But initially, when you cultivate shamatha, so any sound will immediately distract our attention. So that at the beginner stage, we need to remain in a conducive environment, a place that is quiet, also a place where you can easily get your provisions, and also you should be have less greed, easy to content with, and also a simple lifestyle, and also have very little involvement like writing or composing a book, and all of these distractions should be avoided. So the bulk of the time should be really focused on single pointedness, and you must also have a pure morality, because ethical discipline is very important, because the key function of concentration is the application of mindfulness and awareness. And the first step of cultivating mindfulness and awareness is by living a moral life. For example, if you are a monk, that even if you're in your dream, if you are able to bring the awareness of I'm a monk, I'm a monk. So if you cultivate that awareness during the daytime, even in dream, even when temptations arise, you will be able to bring up this awareness that I'm a monk. So it is through cultivating moral life that you will be able to perfect your ability to apply mindfulness and awareness. So you need a conducive environment which will enhance and promote all of these conditions that would lead to kind of, dispose you more towards this quiet mind. So like a quiet place. So then he goes on to explain what are those specific, each of these conditions are. Why the need for simple life. Many years ago, I met in Barcelona, in Spain, Montserrat Monastery. When I visited this place, I met an old monk, a Christian monk, and I was told he had lived as a hermit on the mountain behind the monastery for 5 years. And he lived a very simple life, just ate no hot meal. So he lived like a hermit. So he came to see me. So I had conversations with him. So I asked him I heard that you lived for 5 years as a hermit. So what did you practice? What was you meditating on? He said, I meditated on love. So when he said that, I could see in his expression, his eyes, there was something very profound, which is very unique expression. I was so impressed. So this hermit, or a Christian monk, so lived a total life of seclusion in an isolated place. So initially, when we develop shamatha, we need to seek that kind of solitude. So you should also avoid associating with too many people because it tend to lead to all sorts of conversations that aggravate feeling of attachment and aversions and so on, and also have a basis of morality, live a pure life of observance. So then he's talking about the need to also reflect upon impermanent nature of all things so that you have less attachment. So those are the conditions that needs to be cultivated for successful attainment of shamatha. For vipassana, first you have to seek a teacher who is versed in the teachings of emptiness. So here we are talking about vipassana focused on emptiness. So here the vipassana that is focused on emptiness, and you need to seek a teacher. You cannot have, because we are so used to the perspective arising from our ignorance, grasping at true existence. So unless someone who is an experienced teacher who can introduce us, draw our attention to, we will not be able to have spontaneous understanding of this truth. So then you need to cultivate knowledge through study, and then you should seek a teacher who is versed in the teachings, who is compassionate, and at his feet you should study. Because insight on emptiness arises on the basis of study, critical reflection, and meditation. So the first step is to really study many texts. So the text that we study, we need to be able to distinguish. So how do we choose the right kind of scriptures? So here the Buddha has shown us the path, that we should not rely just on the person, but on the teachings, not on the words, but the meaning, and then not on the provisional meaning, but on the definitive meaning, and on the experiential understanding, not just on the intellectual understanding. So in the sutras, there are many diverse teachings, many of which are taught, for specific needs of an audience of a given time. So if we take all of these scriptures at their face value, there will be a problem. Because, for example, the Buddha has stated in one of the scriptures that the 5 aggregates are the burden, and person is the carrier of those burden. So almost suggesting there is a self that is independent, person that is independent of the aggregates. So for the person who believes in such independent self so strongly, if Buddha were to teach them there is no such self, it will cause a disturbance. I remember many years ago, I had a student who was from Bihar. He was a professor of a Bihar university. So later, he became interested in Buddhism and he became a monk and took ordination from me. So, in one day, in the course of a conversation, we were discussing no self. And although he has become monk and gained ordination, so when he heard that there is no self, there was a sense, he was gripped by a sense of terror. If there is no self, he felt so uncomfortable. So I had to sort of calm him down to tell him that no self does not mean there is nothing. I had to give him a lot of explanation and clarification. So in a sense, so I told him that the teaching on no self is like looking at a coin from two sides. From one side, the teaching is no self. It's from the side of the absence. So the two truths are two sides of the same coin, so viewed from two different perspectives. So if we look at the reality in an unexamined way, from that perspective, things exist. That's the conventional reality. But if you look at it from an ultimate perspective, inquiring into what they are, then there is nothing. So that is the emptiness perspective. So I was able to calm him down. So you can see that in the Buddha's scriptures, there are also statements where he says that there are no person, but karma exists inherently. But in some sutras, he says that external objects don't exist, material objects, but consciousness exists. So there are diverse teachings that are given by the Buddha in consonant with the needs of the specific disciples. So even in the writings of Asanga, when he explains comments on a particular citation from he in his commentary on Uttara Tantra, he explains it from the perspective of Madhyamaka. But in other texts like Bodhisattva Bhumi, then he presents the perspective of Chittamatra, mind only, as if intrinsic nature exists on the conventional level. And it's said that these texts were written by Asanga for the specific need of his own student and brother, Vasubandhu. So the perspective is really from the Chittamatra. So therefore we make distinctions between the intention of the text and the intention of the author. So the author's intention may be that of Madhyamaka, but the particular text written by that author for a specific need, then the intention of that text could be not that of Madhyamaka. So this leads us to the distinction of provisional meaning and definitive meaning of scriptures. So there are different ways in which these two are defined, but in a sense, the scriptures that present the teachings on emptiness, they are definitive. Scriptures that present not emptiness, but other aspects of the Buddha's teachings, they are provisional in their meaning. So so in this text, Kamalashila's text, he talks about how those who wish to genuinely cultivate insight into emptiness, should be vegetarian. But then in Madhyamaka Hridaya, Essence of Middle Way, in Bhava Viveka's text, he qualifies this emphasis on vegetarianism and says that practitioners should to really avoid eating meat that are specifically killed, if you know. So, but in other texts like Langa Avatara Sutra, there is a kind of a blanket prescription on avoiding eating meat. So, so there are different presentations of this in the Buddhist scriptures. So as much as possible, yeah, it's helpful to be vegetarian. So even though it may be very difficult for a lot of people, because of their health and for other reasons, maybe not possible to completely become vegetarian, but as much as possible, it's better to be vegetarian. In my case, in Tibet, when I was 14, 15-year old, I initially they were using a lot of meat in the ceremonial feast and stuff. So when I was in my teenage, I really made sure that the official feasts were all vegetarian. And then later, when I came to India, in it's 1965, I think, I wanted to become vegetarian. So I actually gave up meat. So about 20 months, I was able to, over a year, I tried it. Then it led to health problems, particularly jaundice. My eyes, even my nails turned yellow. Even the skin color. So there was no particular pain, but the body, but I had very weak energy level, low level of energy. So I remained like that for a couple of weeks. Then I consulted the Indian doctors as well as my Tibetan physician, and they said that it was jaundice is the problem. So later I jokingly told people that at that time, because of the yellowness of my skin color, even my nails, I was so actually I became a living Buddha at that time. It's not because of practice, but because of illness. I almost acquired a kind of a golden light color. So, so, so the doctors urged me to, because of my having exposed to non-vegetarian diet from such an early age, so he said that I should return to my original. So then I stopped being strict vegetarian. So in a week, maybe 2 or 3 times, I eat non-vegetarian. And similarly in monastery in India, in all the monasteries, so most of them are now the common kitchen vegetarian. We made that about 10, 15 years ago, and also big schools. So this is where trying to create an example within the community. And in the centers, in Buddhist centers in the West, so sometimes you have this odd situation where the lamas and gishi resident teachers eat meat, but the Dharma students don't eat meat. So individually, whether one does whatever one is something else, but as an institution, like 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 Dharma centers, kind of ceremonies and so on, these should be vegetarian. So in Dharamsala, when we had ceremonial festivals, because otherwise Amtoas, when they get together, they really eat a lot of meat. So Kamala Shila explains that also it's important to eat with measure. This question of measure is important because even from the health point of view, eating too much is bad for your health. I was I was at Harvard once. I gave a series of philosophy lectures. I had a driver at the time. He was a really fat guy. So when he sits down, the car seat wasn't actually enough for his bum. So when he's driving, so every so if there is a 10-15 minute drive, he always has to eat something. He was always snacking. So of course he became big partly by eating a lot. So, so I often tease people. So the monks, So we don't eat after afternoon. We don't eat supper. So I was in Holland once. There were people. There's a there's a lady who has worked so hard for the Tibetan cause for a long time, and she's quite heavy. So I told that the monks don't eat dinner. So those who have weight issues, if you follow the example of the Buddhist monks and don't eat supper, then you can solve the problem of weight. And there were a lot of people who had weight issues were shaking their head in agreement. but but of course, weight is something that everybody thinks about. And if it is a serious issue, then don't eat too much. And if you have a problem, then think of poverty that is in the world. People who have nothing to eat. So in restaurants, so many places they throw leftovers. When I see them, I always feel bad because I have the image of people who are starving. So then Kamatashila explains the importance of purity of intention, because whether or not one's activities become spiritual or true Dharma practice is defined by one's intention and motivation. And then he explains the ritual of the 7 limb practices, beginning with making prostrations, paying homage, making offerings, and so on. So it doesn't really matter the length of the text that you use. Similarly, when it comes to merit field meditation, the extensiveness or brevity of a text is not important. It's just what is important is to do the visualization. So you just imagine the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in front of you, pay homage, make offerings, and so on. And then Kamalashila explains the need to find a good sitting place which will facilitate long extended periods of sitting, formal sitting. And then he's explaining the postures of your body, how to place your hands, your eyes, the tongue, and the importance of keeping your back straight, and so on. So shamatha, when you're cultivating shamatha, the posture of the body is important. So your legs cross-legged or half crossed. So whatever is convenient, whatever is comfortable. So you find a comfortable posture, your hands in a meditative posture. So lower palm, left palm underneath, the right palm on top, with the two thumbs touching each other, forming a kind of a triangle at your navel. And especially if you're doing Tummo practice, that's important. And then your spine should be straight, not bent, like an arrow. And then your teeth left in a natural position, your lips in a natural position, and then your tip of your tongue just gently touching the upper palate of your mouth. And your head should not be just lift up, but gently bent down, and your eyes gently cast in front of you, if you were to look at it, you will be able to see the tip of your nose. A lot of white people, you will have no problem because you've got a rather long nose. Whereas those who have a flat nose, then if you try to focus too much, you will have strain on your eyes. But there are some meditation practices which are very specific, where you have to glance upwards, such as in Dzogchen practices. Sometimes you have to look up in the space. But generally, here we're talking about the shamatha practice, where you basically keep your eyes with a soft kind of glance, not any specific focus. And your shoulders should be relaxed. And your breath should not be too harsh, forceful, so much so that it makes noise, but softly, not too shallow, and not too forceful, a kind of a gentle rhythm of your breathing. And also not uneven breaths. So basically finding a natural rhythm of your breath. And so as explained in Abhidhamma Kosha, there are practices that choose breath as the object of your shamatha practice. We see this tradition particularly strong in Burma and Thailand. I know some Indian teachers who specialize in vipassana and shamatha. His transmission came from Burma. He's Goenka. He passed away. Someone I knew. So his lineage really comes from Burma. So this kind of breathing practice is helpful, especially when our mind is disturbed and restless. And when you are simply focusing your attention on your breath, as you breathe in, noting the inhalation and noting the exhalation, and simply noting the movement of your in-breath and out-breath, that will help the mind bring to the kind of the restless mind to bring down to a sort of a calm state. So simply by paying attention to the breath, you can even use counting up to 20, up to 30, up to 40. So by focusing on your breath and counting it mentally, immediately will bring the restless mind to a more restful state. And also, you can cultivate single pointedness, simple on the counting of the breath. Say 100 times, 1,000 times count. This will really help because gradually the image, what is called nimitta, will arise in your mind. But initially choosing breath is helpful because it is not too subtle an object nor too gross an external material object. So it's a middle way, and it's an easy target, and you can cultivate single pointedness, focus just on the breath. A single pointedness of an attention focused on a chosen object, as you are able to maintain this unwavering for a long time, and as it affects the very movement of energy within your body, and a lightness of body arises, which makes you feel your body supple and mind supple, in giving rise to an experience of bliss. And that's when true shamatha has arisen. So then Kamalashila explains that once you've attained single pointedness of shamatha, and then when you apply analysis based on that single pointed attention, then insight or vipassana arises. So then Kamalashila explains how the suppleness of the body and suppleness of mind arises, and then at that point one has attained true shamatha. And this suppleness of body and mind give rise to a bliss of body and mind. And once that suppleness becomes more firm, it leads to vipassana. So, so the actual object of shamatha is not the external object, but rather the reflection of that, internal reflection of that in one's mind, which is called nimitta or reflection. So then Kamalashila explains the various types of object one can choose for the cultivation of shamatha, including even the 12 aspects of the scriptures. And then, so what is important for shamatha is not to elaborate your object, but kind of absorb your mind on a single pointedness of the chosen object. Whereas when you are engaging in analysis of insight, then absorption is not the objective. The objective is to penetrate into the nature of that reality, and therefore elaboration becomes part of it because you are inquiring. So in shamatha, you are absorbing and placing your mind absorbed single pointedly. In vipassana, you are now penetrating by critically inquiring into the nature. So you can also cultivate shamatha choosing the image of the Buddha as your object, and which is recommended because it serves two purposes. One is the cultivation of shamatha, but also accumulation of merit as well for the Buddhists. By choosing to meditate on the Buddha, it accumulates merits as well. So here Kamalashila cites from the sutra where a recommendation is made to choose the image of the Buddha as the object of your shamatha practice. So the obstacles to cultivation of shamatha are the mental sinking or laxity and mental excitation. So mental excitation arises when our mind becomes distracted, So including even virtuous objects. So when you are cultivating shamatha, we have to find a way to place our mind single-pointedly on the chosen object and not distracted even by virtuous thoughts like faith, inspirations, and so on. So, so we have to place our mind single-pointedness so there is a stability. So even though you might have stability, but if there is no clarity, if there is no vibrancy or quality of your, then there will be a kind of a laxity. There's a kind of almost like the mental sinking arises. So therefore, mental laxity and mental excitation needs to be, prevented. So but there's when we talk about mental laxity, it should not be confused with mental sinking. Mental sinking is a very deep, almost a kind of a sleep-like state. But there could be but even though there might be a lot of mental sinking, but if there is an element of lack of clarity, then mental laxity is still present. I have a friend who was a meditator. He told me that after several extended meditation for a long period of time, he felt that his critical acumen was being dulled. So I told him that this is probably because, although he must have a stability of mind, because there is no clarity of mind, maybe his mind is becoming habituated to this relaxed but not very sharp state of mind. So mental sinking and mental laxity is also an issue. So therefore, we need clarity and vibrancy of that mind. So the method for preventing these two obstacles, so because mental laxity arises when the state of mind is too low, mental excitation arises when our mind is too uplifted and too alert. When it's too alert, then there is mental excitation arises. When it's too low, arousal is too low, then mental laxity arises. So we need to find a middle way so that we have to lift our mind up so the mind is aroused a bit, not too aroused. And this is something that we have to judge by own personal experience. At what level of arousal does it lead to excitation? And at what low level of arousal it leads to mental sinking and mental laxity. So this is something that we have to judge from our own personal experience. So we need to ask ourselves, whether or not the state of mind is too aroused or too laxed. So when it's too low, then we need to uplift our mind by reflecting upon something that will make our mind more aroused, thinking about the Buddha's qualities and so on. So for example, like in the Dzogchen practice, the recommendation is made by going to a high points to be able to, watch sunrises or sunsets, to have a kind of a more aroused state of mind. So when there is a pure air and high point where you can have this vast vista, and then you can have a kind of a more clear, aroused state of mind. La. So on the other hand, if you find your mind to be too aroused and excited, that's when you need to reflect upon something that would dampen your state of mind and bring it to a more kind of low level of arousal, such as reflecting upon impermanence, suffering, and so on. And when your mind is in this middle, not too aroused and not too low aroused, then you should maintain equanimity. So because when there is no mental excitation and mental laxity, and then if you become too exerting, then again that becomes an obstacle. So you need to remain equanimity at that time. So this is how cultivation of shamatha is explained. So for most of us Vajrayana practitioners who do deity yoga, we can cultivate shamatha based on deity yoga. And those who practice tumo, you can also cultivate shamatha in the context of tumo practice. So these are part of the generation stage practice of Vajrayana, highest yoga tantra. So initial stage of completion stage practice as well. So whatever approach is more effective to you, you should choose. But in generally, you choose the image of the Buddha as the object of your shamatha practice. The next, he explains the method for cultivating vipassana, insight. So we have already explained this, basically emphasizing the point that shamatha alone is not adequate. Wisdom needs to be cultivated in the context of insight. So what exactly kind of wisdom that we are talking about here? Kamalashila is saying that it is the wisdom of no self and emptiness. Kamalashila was a student of, principal student of Shantarakshita. Shantarakshita was a Madhyamaka teacher. Within the Madhyamaka school, he was the Yogacara Madhyamaka. He upheld the view of the Yogacara Madhyamaka. So what distinguishes himself from Yogacara is, although he agrees with Yogacara in the denial of the reality of external material world, but what distinguishes his standpoint is that unlike the Yogacara or Chittamantra philosophy, which believes in the substantial existence of consciousness, such as alaya, the foundational consciousness, Shantarakshita accepts all phenomena to be devoid of true existence, inherent existence. So, Bhava Viveka accepts external reality, whereas Shantarakshita does not accept external reality. So in Sakya terminology, Yogacara Madhyamaka perspective is referred to as the advanced Svatrantika, whereas the standpoint of Bhava Viveka is referred to as the less advanced Svatrantika Madhyamaka. In any case, so in Bhava Viveka's commentary on Nagarjuna's text, Bhava Viveka critiques the commentary of Buddha Palita. He presents extensive criticism so he raises critical questions about Buddha Palita's commentary. And these objections and criticism were responded to by Chandrakirti in his Prachanapada, clear words, and where he explains that how Buddha Palita's interpretation is actually free of fault, whereas Bhava Viveka's objections are groundless, and in fact Bhava Viveka's own interpretation of Nagarjuna's view is flawed, particularly his acceptance of intrinsic reality, intrinsic existence. So many aspects of Bhava Viveka's interpretation were subject to critical inquiry. So on this basis, among the commentators of Nagarjuna, a distinction is drawn between those who accepts intrinsic existence, at least on the conventional level, and those who reject intrinsic nature, even on the conventional level. So very subtle distinctions are drawn. So, and Kamalashila is a follower of Shantarakshita and Bhavaviveka's approach. So, therefore, when rejecting the inherent existence, Kamalashila qualifies it by saying in the ultimate sense. So, which suggests that he does accept on the conventional level some kind of intrinsic nature. So within Madhyamaka school, distinction is drawn between two camps. One camp rejects intrinsic nature even on the conventional level, and one camp that accepts intrinsic nature on the conventional level. So according to Chandrakirti and his followers, says that if we do not reject intrinsic nature, even on the conventional level, some basis for objectification and grasping will remain. For example, Nagarjuna explains in the 60 verses that so long as some basis for objectification is left, undestroyed, grasping will arise, because clinging will arise. So if we relate to this, reflect upon these, by relating to our own personal understanding and perception, it will be really helpful. In Dzogchen's terminology, they talk about groundless, devoid of roots. This is what they, we are not saying that nothing exists. Things do exist, but the manner in which things exist is only in terms of dependent origination. Nagarjuna says that whatever is dependent origination has been declared to be empty. That is dependently designated, and that is the true middle way. So that the way in which things exist is only in terms of dependent origination. So that's why the phrase is used, mere conditionedness of things. Mere conditionedness of things. So all phenomena, their existence can be understood only in terms of aggregation of their conditions. And their existence is to be understood only on the conventional level, as understood by common consensus. For example, in entering the middle way, Chandrakirti says that when you subject the concept of person to sevenfold analysis, person is not to be found even on the conventional level. And then he then goes on to say that we can extend the same analysis to everything, vases, trees, external objects, and so on. Therefore, he then concludes that the existence of phenomena can only be grounded purely within the boundary and framework of conventional truth. There is no basis for any objective existence that we can attribute to phenomena. And this is explained in Nagarjuna's own precious garland. He says that things do not exist. It's just only what is left is just names and terms and designations. When we subject objects like the external matter to analysis, even the elements which compose these phenomena do not exist objectively. And similarly, because material phenomena do not exist inherently, therefore absence of that, which is space, cannot exist inherently and objectively as well. So in this way, everything that we have concepts of do not relate to anything that is outside. They are just designation, and therefore even the designations themselves, terms themselves, do not exist objectively. So, but in our naive perception of the world, we feel as if things exist outside, solidly, concretely, and we then cling on to them. So, therefore, Nagarjuna really emphasizes really undermining that kind of assumed existence of things out there that we believe so deeply as if possessing some kind of concrete reality out there. So, therefore, Nagarjuna uses dependent origination as the highest reason to prove the emptiness of all phenomena. So this is important to know that within the Nagarjuna's followers, there were distinctions, differences between two camps. So then he goes on to explains that how person, once you exclude the mind, body, perceptions, and so on, there is no independent person left in the aftermath. So not only is there no self that is independent of the aggregates, nor is there a self that is somehow owner or master of the body and mind. So there are various ways in which we have this concept of self. So the distinctions are made, being drawn between the different levels of grasping at self. So then he goes on to explain that the person is not the body and mind, because aggregates are multiple, person is one, self is one. So then here he is negating the non-Buddhist view, because the self, according to non-Buddhist, is eternal, but the aggregates, which is the basis of the arising of sense of self, are impermanent. And then he is negating the Buddhist personalist school's views, which is to believe in substantially real person, which is neither independent nor identical with the aggregates. So then he, having explained the selflessness of person, then he explains the selflessness of phenomena. And then he says the phenomena refers to the aggregates such as the form, perception, feelings, and so on. So this is very similar to the quantum physics that I spoke earlier. When you subject phenomena and dissect the various components that make up their existence, once you remove and eliminate all of these various parts, there's nothing left that is the thing. Then he's explained the Madhyamaka view that not only are external objects not findable when you subject them to critical analysis, the same is true also of the internal world of mind and consciousness. If you examine consciousness, what you have is the stream of consciousness, and if you subject each of these members that constitute the stream, there is no objective existence of what we call consciousness. He explains that they are illusion-like. They seem to appear as if they are real. So when you subject the nature of mind to analysis, we don't find them outside nor inside. We don't see the past mind, future mind, even the present mind. So when we talk about past, present, and future, we can't even find the present, because when we look at the concept of present, if a present exists objectively, then the entire 12 months of a year should be present. But within the entire year, you have 12 years. within which there's a sequence. So, so not all 12 months of the year are present. So the same is true also of the month. Month is composed of 30 or odd days, and each of these days become a present. Yesterday is past, tomorrow, and what comes after a future. But the present, the morning is gone. We're in afternoon. It's about 3:40. So what comes after is future. So now if we look at the present, so we had this session. We have spent about almost 3 hours. So the early part is gone. What we are talking about now. Now if we further divide it into minutes, seconds, and so on, there's no past, there's no present, because what is gone is all finished. What is yet to come is not there. So where is the present? So 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 if we can't find present, then how can we define past and future? Because past and future are defined in relation to the present. And what has happened before is past, what is yet to come is future. So in this way, we conventionally define past, present, and future. So if present cannot be found, then how can you define past and future? But on the other hand, we cannot say these things don't exist, because we can talk about past Buddhas, we can talk about past lives, future lives, and so on. So then what does that mean? This means that all of this can be said to exist only conventionally, relationally, and dependently. They do not possess any objective, independent existence. The same is true of our inner world of consciousness and outer world of matter. So that is true of everything. So when we talk about the present mind, so we have to say it came from the past. But in actual reality, there is no past, nor will the mind go somewhere. So when you subject this mind to such analysis, then mind loses its objective existence. Then Kamalashila cites from a sutra. So then, if mind is empty, then the question is, what is that emptiness of mind? Again, the mind emptiness itself cannot be found, because emptiness of mind is defined in relation to the mind, which is the basis. So emptiness too does not exist inherently and independently. Therefore, in the Buddha's Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, he speaks of 16 types of emptiness, 20 types of emptiness, fourfold emptiness, and ultimately two selflessness. So in all of these explanations, he speaks of emptiness of emptiness. Emptiness of the outer, emptiness of inner, emptiness of both inner and outer, and emptiness of emptiness. So whatever it may be, everything is emptiness. So in the Heart Sutra, you I already mentioned how there's a passage which says no form, no feelings, no discriminations, and so on. Then he's clarifying some doubts about the realization of emptiness, meditation on emptiness. He says that meditation on emptiness is not a matter of just simply stopping thought. Simply stopping thought does not, that mere cessation of thought, which is what the Chinese Chan masters were um, propounding in Tibet at the time. And similar questions also been raised in Japan. Um, some scholars, Buddhist scholars, say that in Buddhism, you don't need to engage in analysis. You can simply stop thinking, and stopping of thinking thought leads to enlightenment. So there are people who believe that's the case. So Kamala Shila is rejecting, critiquing those standpoints. The suggestion that simply stopping thought is what is required. He's explaining that it is through perfecting our faculty of analysis, engaging in critical inquiry, ultimately the thought, discursiveness of thought is overcome. It's not simply through disengagement and stopping thought. So he gives the examples of how striking dry wood can light a fire, but the fire will eventually consume the stick itself. And this is how thought is dissolved, not through simply stopping it. So here he explains that it is through critical inquiry and analysis and penetrating into the nature of reality, one will be able to destroy all basis for objectification and grasping. It is not simply through rejecting thought or stopping thought one gains insight into the nature of the truth. So, even in meditation on emptiness, once you have gained a deep absorption on emptiness, at that time you shouldn't apply analysis. You have to maintain the equilibrium, equanimity of the mind. So, once you have a realization of shamatha, and then when you move on to insight, then through application of analysis, absorption arises. So, having meditated on emptiness in this manner, based on the union of shamatha and insight, so during the formal sitting, you meditate on emptiness, and during the after session periods, so then your perception of the world will be that of illusion-like. You will see them as illusion-like, and while in that state, you accumulate merit. You engage in purification of negativity, negative karma, and accumulation of great stores of merit. So all of this activity will take place on the basis of awareness of all phenomena as dreamlike, not just the external objects, but yourself, samsara, nirvana, virtues, negative karma, and so on. And with the awareness of all of this as dreamlike, illusion-like, one will be able to accumulate merits and wisdom, engage in generosity, observe moral discipline, and so on. So this kind of cultivation of emptiness meditation is because it is accompanied and complemented by compassion and bodhicitta and so on. It really becomes a factor for attainment of Buddha's omniscient mind. Because if emptiness is cultivated alone without the complementary factor of compassion and bodhicitta, then it becomes only a factor for gaining liberation from samsara. So Kamalashila here explains the need for meditating on emptiness combined with the method aspect of the path, compassion and bodhicitta. So then he emphasizes the need for method and wisdom to be not partial. So we'll stop here. So we'll finish it tomorrow. But so about 5 or 6 Tibetan folios are left. So we will finish tomorrow. We'll stop here. What do you think? Did you understand something? Is it tough?
Some help. What do you think? Okay. Oh yeah.
Chida yemba da kundu sangbo de tishin de da kunji chiso da gewa da tamje rabdo ngo tusum shebe jawa tamje kana chudo nga ba de sangbo che rabdo ngo waraki sewana seje ga be nga kan ju yon cho che mon kan de da kunjen de da ngo sho na do chuni samye de chosun to ju to dan den development de ta cha ke tembe no ke me nyu do sho.
Thank you. What about tomorrow? They'll be teaching in the morning?
I think that probably in the morning they will be teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the long life is in the morning.
But he might do the rest of the teaching. So tomorrow we will meet at 9 o'clock, maybe before, just before 9, because I have to do some preliminary preparation ritual. It wouldn't take very long, maybe 15 minutes. So let's meet at 8:45. 8:45. So while I'm performing the preliminary ritual, so the rest of the congregation can do the preliminary recitation, such as Heart Sutra and so on. So there will be then. By the time we begin the actual teaching, it will be 9. So before the long life empowerment blessing, I will do the rest of the text, and then once the long life empowerment ceremony is over, I mean in the context of taking the Bodhisattva vows, so we will perform a ceremony of generating the aspiring aspect of the bodhicitta, and then we will do the actual empowerment of long life puja, and then after that there will be the Tenshug ceremony. Okay, that's the plan.
Dalai,